Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Dark Tower VII, The Dark Tower, by Stephen King. Now, this was published in 2004, and this is the seventh and technically final book of Stephen King's epic fantasy series, The Dark Tower. Now, it's technically the final book because the story, like the actual storyline of the Dark Tower series, ends with this book. However, years later, Stephen King wrote an eighth Dark Tower novel titled The Wind Through the Keyhole, which was actually set between the events of books 4 and 5 of this series. So story-wise and continuity-wise, this is the final book in the series, even though there was an eighth one published years later. Now, I've already read all the Dark Tower novels before, but for the past few months I have been rereading and reviewing all the Dark Tower novels in preparation for the new film adaptation of the Dark Tower series. Now, full disclosure, I did not fully reread this novel in preparation for this review, but once again, I have read the novel before, and I'm typically really good at remembering books, even years after I've read them, but I did reread key scenes from this book, and I reread certain sections of the book to refresh my memory, and I'm pretty confident that I could do this review, but once again, I've read the book before, but I did not reread it in preparation for this review. Now, from what I remember of this book, I remember this being honestly my favorite of the final 3 Dark Tower novels. At the same time, however, oddly enough, this is the one that I have the most problems with. Now, as far as the Dark Tower series as a whole goes, I would say the first Dark Tower novel I actually think is the weakest, and my absolute favorite Dark Tower novel is the fourth one, Wizard and Glass, but out of the final 3 Dark Tower books, not counting the 8th one, I would say this is my favorite. At the same time, once again, oddly enough, it's the one that I have the most problems with. Now, the Dark Tower series is a fantasy series, however, the series also incorporates elements of other genres like horror, science fiction, and even Western, and Stephen King often refers to this series as his magnum opus. Now, the series was primarily inspired by the Robert Browning poem, Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came. Stephen King also took a lot of inspiration from Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, as well as spaghetti westerns, and he also took a lot of inspiration from old stories about King Arthur for his Dark Tower series. You could also definitely see a Lovecraft influence on a lot of aspects of this series as well. Now, one of the main concepts of the Dark Tower series is this idea of alternate universes and other dimensions, and the whole idea of this series is that there is a multiverse. Basically, there are hundreds and thousands, possibly even millions, or even an infinite number of parallel universes, and each universe has its own version of planet Earth, and basically the whole idea of this series is that all these universes are held together by this thing called the Dark Tower, and what's really interesting about this series is essentially all of Stephen King's other books are connected to this series in some way, shape, or form. Like, because the series deals with the concept of a multiverse, you're supposed to assume that the events from all of Stephen King's other books and short stories have been happening in these various different parallel universes that make up the Dark Tower multiverse. Now, the series is primarily set in an alternate universe known as Midworld, which used to be a lot like our world, or at least it's implied that it used to be a lot like our world thousands of years prior to the events of this story, and the series follows this man named Roland Desjane, who is the last gunslinger. Gunslingers were basically like knights in this world, and throughout the series, Roland is looking for the Dark Tower, and he eventually teams up with people from our world who join him, and all of them form what Roland calls a Ka-Tet. Now, it's going to be next to impossible to explain the plotline of this book without also giving away a few spoilers about what happened in the Dark Tower novels leading up to this. And also, the plotline of this book is very point A to point B. The way the book is structured is, it's very episodic in the way that it's structured, but the book eventually leads to this battle at the end with the Crimson King, this battle to save the Dark Tower. Now, the Crimson King is this powerful, interdimensional demon who wants to destroy the Dark Tower, and if the Dark Tower is destroyed, the multiverse will cease to exist. So that means Midworld and our world and all the other parallel universes will come to an end. Now, the Crimson King, it never says it flat out, but it heavily implies in these last 3 Dark Tower novels that the Crimson King is either Satan or the being that we as humans have always interpreted as Satan. Now, in Book 5 of this series, Wolves of the Kala, it was revealed that Susanna was pregnant with the child of a demon named Mia, which was actually a direct result of something that happened in the 3rd Dark Tower novel, The Wastelands, but was also a direct result of something that Roland did in the 1st Dark Tower novel, The Gunslinger. Now, Mia is actually a succubus that was actually commissioned by the Crimson King to be the mother of his child. It turns out there's this ancient prophecy that one day a child will be born who will have powers strong enough to completely destroy the Dark Tower, which will destroy existence as we know it. Basically, this child will be the Antichrist, and the Crimson King commissions Mia to be the mother of this Antichrist. So Mia ended up impregnating Susanna with this child, and if you've read the 3rd Dark Tower novel, you'll understand how Susanna became impregnated with this child. But this child is also, oddly enough, Roland's child as well, which if you've read the 1st Dark Tower novel, like if you've read all the Dark Tower novels leading up to this, you'll understand how that's possible, but once again, I don't want to give too much away about that, and also, it's just a lot to explain. But in Book 6 of this series, Song of Susanna, Mia ended up taking Susanna into our world in the year 1999, and she took her to this restaurant in New York City called the Dixie Pig, which is actually a hangout for vampires and low men. Low men are these humanoid creatures who work for the Crimson King, and this restaurant called the Dixie Pig also has these dimensional gateways leading into Midworld. And in that book, Father Callahan, Jake, and Oy also ended up in New York City in the year 1999, and they tried to save Susanna from Mia. Now, in Song of Susanna, Roland and Eddie ended up in our world in the year 1977, specifically Maine in the year 1977, and there they met Stephen King. Stephen King actually makes himself a character in these last 2 Dark Tower novels, which is something that actually threw a lot of Dark Tower fans off. Now, this whole series deals with the concept of multiple realities and multiple universes, and the whole idea of this series is that each universe has its own version of planet Earth, and these last 3 Dark Tower novels deal with this particular version of Earth known as Keystone Earth, and on this version of Earth, Stephen King himself exists, and the whole idea that's presented in these last 2 Dark Tower novels is, what if everything that Stephen King ever wrote about in his books and short stories has actually been happening in all these different parallel universes? However, the character of Stephen King is unaware of this. Now, in these last 2 Dark Tower novels, you find out about this being called Gan, who is actually the one who created the Dark Tower, as well as Midworld, and as well as the Keystone universe, and all the other universes that the Dark Tower holds together. Gan is basically God, and it turns out that Gan has been sending these messages subconsciously to Stephen King's head about certain events that have been happening in all these different parallel universes, and Stephen King has been writing these down, interpreting them as fiction. Like, that's the idea that Stephen King presents in these last 2 Dark Tower books, and he makes himself a prominent character in these last 2 books. But in book 6 of this series, Song of Susanna, Roland and Eddie end up meeting Stephen King in Maine. Now, hopefully I explained enough background to get into the plotline of this novel. So, the plot of this novel, and once again, the plot is very point A to point B, but in the beginning of the story, you see Father Callahan, Jake, and Oy prepare to do battle against the vampires and the low men at this restaurant in New York City called the Dixie Pig, and they're trying to save Susanna from Mia, but at this point, Mia and Susanna have already been taken back to Midworld, and Mia has been separated from Susanna and has turned into a human woman, and she ends up being the one to give birth to this demon child who, once again, is basically the Antichrist and is the son of the Crimson King. Now, this demon child ends up getting named Mordred, which is obviously a reference to the Mordred from the old legends of King Arthur. Susanna manages to get away from Mordred, who is now maturing at a rapid rate. But eventually, all the members of the Ka-Tet, including Susanna, are all reunited with each other in Midworld, and they continue on their quest for the Dark Tower. But as the book goes on, you realize that Mordred is now following them, and it's become Mordred's ultimate goal to kill Roland, who you realize has been chosen by Gan to be the savior of the Dark Tower. Eventually, the Ka-Tet end up at this place called Blue Heaven, which is essentially a prison camp for people with telekinetic powers. It turns out that for years, the Crimson King has been sending the low men into other dimensions to abduct people with telekinetic powers and take them to Blue Heaven, where the low men harnessed their telekinetic powers and used them to break the beams that hold the Dark Tower in place, and these people are called the Breakers. And in this part of the novel, the Ka-Tet now have to free the Breakers and stop the low men, and they get help from 3 people with telekinetic powers. One of them is actually somebody from Roland's past. Now, in the 4th Dark Tower novel, Wizard and Glass, in the parts of that book that took place when Roland was a teenager, you found out that Roland knew this mentally challenged boy named She Shimi. Shimi comes back in this novel, but of course he's much older now, and it's revealed that Shimi actually has telekinetic powers, and it turns out that the low men have captured him and are using him as a breaker. And now the Ka-Tet have to join forces with Shimi and these two other psychics named Dinky Earnshaw and Ted Brautigan to bring down Blue Heaven. Now, Ted Brautigan is actually a character from Stephen King's novel Hearts in Atlantis. Now, Hearts in Atlantis was actually 5 interlocking stories, and specifically Ted Brautigan was a character from the first story of that book, Low Men in Yellow Coats. And when Ted Brautigan first meets the Ka-Tet and he first sees Jake, at first he actually mistakes Jake for Bobby Garfield, who is another character from Hearts in Atlantis, implying that there might be some kind of connection between Bobby Garfield and Jake Chambers. But once again, in this part of the novel, the Ka-Tet and Shimi, Dinky, and Ted Brautigan join forces to try to stop the Low Men and free the Breakers, and once again bring down Blue Heaven. And I don't want to give away too much about what happens in this part of the novel. Now, after taking care of all this business with Blue Heaven, Roland discovers that Stephen King's life is now in danger. Now, even though Stephen King, the character of Stephen King from this book, did not actually create Midworld, nor did he actually create the universes in which his stories take place, you realize that because the Dark Tower is weakening, the Dark Tower needs Stephen King, and Gan needs Stephen King to be telling the story of the Dark Tower, as well as the stories of what's going on in all these other universes to other people in the Keystone universe. So if Stephen King dies, it could mean really bad things for the Dark Tower. Now, in real life, back in 1999, Stephen King was actually hit by a distracted driver, and he almost died, and Stephen King actually fictionalizes that real-life accident in this story. Now, in the story, you realize that that accident was actually something orchestrated by the Crimson King in an attempt to kill Stephen King. So, in this section of the book, Roland has to go to the Keystone universe in the year 1999 and try to save Stephen King's life, but unfortunately this comes at a great cost to Roland. Now, while in the Keystone universe, Roland also goes to New York City and he meets the members of this corporation who are actually protecting the rose. Now, it turns out that there's this magic rose that is sort of like the Dark Tower's representation in the Keystone universe, and if anything happens to this rose, it will mean really bad things for the Dark Tower. So there's this corporation that's actually protecting the rose. And the members of this corporation are aware that everything that Stephen King ever wrote about in his books and short stories has actually been happening in different parallel universes. So they give Roland a copy of the book Insomnia by Stephen King and tell him about a character from that book named Patrick Danville, who they believe will be very important to Roland's quest. Eventually in the story, after Roland has already returned to Midworld, he does actually meet Patrick Danville, and Patrick Danville ends up becoming very important in Roland's final battle with the Crimson King. So, as I said before, the plot of this book is very point A to point B, but at the same time though, each scenario that happens in this book comes at great cost to Roland, because as the book goes on, you see the Ka-Tet get smaller and smaller, and major characters from this series do end up dying in this book. First of all, I apologize for the dramatic change in lighting. I recorded the first part of this video last night, got tired and went to bed, and now I'm recording the rest of the video in the morning. Now, as I mentioned before, I actually really do like this final Dark Tower novel, or I should say I remember really liking this final Dark Tower novel because once again, I didn't fully reread it in preparation for this review, but from what I remember of the book, I actually really do like it. However, this is also, it's probably my favorite of the final three Dark Tower novels, but as I mentioned before, oddly enough, it's also the one that I have the most problems with. Now, I really had no problem with Stephen King actually making himself a character in this book and the previous Dark Tower novel. I actually thought it was kind of cool what he did, but I could totally get why that threw so many Dark Tower fans off. And I thought it was really interesting how he incorporated that real life. I don't want to say it was a tragedy because he didn't die, but it was a very traumatic experience for Stephen King, and I really like how he incorporated that thing that happened to him in real life in this story. Now, something that I actually think is a really creepy coincidence is all that happened on June 19th, 1999, and Stephen King actually made references to that date. Obviously not 1999, but he made references to the date June 19th in some of his other stories that he wrote prior to that accident. For example, in Creepshow, in the crate segment, you find out, like, the date on the crate says June 19th, and Stephen King obviously wrote Creepshow years before he was involved with that accident, so in real life it was a really creepy coincidence, but in context of the Dark Tower storyline, you could interpret it as Gan was actually trying to warn Stephen King of what was to come, so that's why Stephen King had references to the date June 19th in some of his other stories. I mean, that's how I kind of looked at it, but once again, I thought it was really interesting how he fictionalized that real-life accident in this story, and he actually makes the distracted driver who hit him a character in this novel. Obviously, he doesn't use the guy's real name, probably for legal reasons, but I don't really think Stephen King would have used the guy's real name regardless. Now, one thing that's really interesting about Stephen King making himself a character in this story is, even though you realize the character of Stephen King is unaware of the fact that the events from his stories are actually happening in different realities, on a subconscious level, he kind of is aware of this, and even though Stephen King is not actually controlling the events that are happening in his stories, and he's not actually controlling Roland, you realize, and you could interpret this as because the Dark Tower is weakening, you realize that Stephen King is very important to Roland finishing his quest for the Dark Tower, and on a certain level, King is able to manipulate certain events, and there's certain points in this story where Stephen King actually leaves messages for Roland to help him along his quest for the Dark Tower. And also, because Stephen King made himself a character in the previous Dark Tower novel, and in this one, the fourth wall is pretty much completely obliterated in this book. Like, in the narration, Stephen King would often refer to himself, and you realize that the whole book is essentially being narrated by Stephen King. And also, like, normally in a lot of Stephen King's books, not just the Dark Tower series, but in a lot of his books, he would include little references to some of his other stories. Sometimes they're just in-jokes, and sometimes they're meant as legitimate connections, but in this book, he outright says what this is a reference to, or what that's a reference to. Like, he'll outright say, this is a reference to The Long Walk, or this is a reference to Hearts in Atlantis, and I could see the whole fourth wall breaking thing being a little too much for people, because this book is very, very meta. Even though I freaking hate that word, the book is very meta, and I could see that being a problem for some people, but to me, it actually kind of makes sense for this book to break the fourth wall so much, because, once again, King has already made himself a character in this storyline in the previous novels, so it's almost the logical conclusion for this book to be going so meta. One little reference I actually thought was really clever is in the beginning of the story, when Father Callahan is fighting the vampires and the low men, he's using this magical talisman that's actually shaped like the turtle, and this talisman has the power of Gan and the turtle and God, even though, once again, Gan and God may be one and the same, but basically he's using this to fight back against the vampires and the low men, and there's a certain point where the turtle gets knocked out of his hands, and it falls under a table, and Stephen King describes it as falling out of this story forever, and then he says, like a certain paper boat that some of you may remember, and that was an obvious reference to Georgie's paper boat in It. And in speaking of It, this book actually does include a lot of really interesting references to It. Now, King's novel It was already one of the main books that was connected to this series. Like, the turtle from this series was a major character from It. And you're supposed to assume that the Crimson King was already a very similar creature to what Pennywise was. And also, both the Crimson King and Mordred have the ability to change into giant spiders, very much like It. Like, there's a scene in this book where Roland and Susanna have to do battle with this creature that is described as a psychic vampire, a vampire that feeds on emotions. And this creature is actually a shapeshifter, and at one point actually takes on the form of a clown. Now, a lot of Stephen King fans have interpreted this character as actually being Pennywise, like maybe the Crimson King brought Pennywise back to use him as, or it, as a weapon against Roland, but Stephen King has said this is not actually the case. However, this creature is apparently supposed to be of the same species that Pennywise was. But I really appreciated a lot of the references to It in this story, being that It is my favorite book by Stephen King. Now, one thing I thought was really cool is, at the end of the book, after the story is over, you get the original poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning, which is the poem that inspired this entire series. And I thought that was really cool how Stephen King included that actual poem at the end. Now I want to come to what is probably my biggest problem with this book, and that is how this book handles Randall Flagg. Now, Randall Flagg was a major villain from this series. He was also the main villain of Stephen King's novel The Stand, as well as his novel The Eyes of the Dragon. Now, in the Dark Tower series, you find out that Randall Flagg is actually an evil wizard named Walter O'Dim. Like, you realize that Randall Flagg, or Walter O'Dim, whichever you want to call him, is actually the Crimson King's right-hand man, and the Crimson King has been using him as an agent of chaos, and Flag has the ability to travel into different dimensions. So in The Stand, he traveled into that particular version of our world, that particular version of Earth, and he used his magic to help the Captain Trips virus spread the way it did, which brought about the end of civilization on that particular version of Earth. And my major issue with this book is it criminally underuses Flag, because Randall Flagg has been a major villain in this series up until this point, but this book really underuses the character to a point where, like, I don't know what Stephen King was thinking when he did what he did to the character in this book. Now, in this book, and I'm going to be getting into some minor spoilers here, but in this book you actually find out a lot about Flagg's backstory. The issue is King doesn't focus on his backstory enough. Now, there is something to be said about revealing too much about a villain, but at the same time, though, he brings up Flagg's backstory, and when you find out Flagg's backstory, you actually feel some sympathy for him. Like, I don't want to say exactly what happened. All you really know is it appears that he used to be a regular human, but something happened to him that traumatized him and caused him to start practicing black magic, and eventually he became the powerful wizard that we know in The Stand and the Dark Tower series. And when you find out his backstory, once again, he actually has a rather sympathetic backstory. The issue is King doesn't really focus too much on this backstory, which wouldn't be a problem, but another issue I had is how Flag dies in this book, because Flag does die in this book, and I actually don't mind how he died, because it's really his ego that brings about his downfall, which is actually really fitting for the character. The issue I have is he dies way too freaking early in this book. Like, I would have really liked to have seen Flag be one of the main villains of this book. Like, maybe you have Flag, like, working alongside Mordred or something. And the issue is, Flag gets killed off really sadistically in this book. But the issue I have with this is you kill him off so sadistically right after you give his rather sympathetic backstory, and I really felt like that wasn't the right way to handle the character. So, to me, that was the biggest sin of this novel, was this novel's misuse of the character of Randall Flagg. Now I want to briefly touch on this book's ending. Now, this book had a very polarizing and controversial ending. Now, I don't want to say I loved the ending, but I also really didn't hate the ending either. Like, I feel like I kind of accept the ending. Like, I accept how Stephen King chose to end this book, and I actually really respect the ending, even though maybe if I was Stephen King, I probably would have chose to end it a little differently, but here's the thing. I'm not Stephen King, and Stephen King, this is his story, and he chose to end it the way he wanted to end it, and I completely respect that. At the same time, I also respect the negative fan reaction to how Stephen King chose to end the book. Now, I'm sure there were a lot of Stephen King fans who probably wanted to go Annie Wilkes on his ass for how he ended this book, but once again, I accept the ending of this book, and I respect what Stephen King did, even if it's not my ideal ending for this series. Once again, even though I really do love this series, ultimately, this is Stephen King's series, so it's really almost not my place to say how he should have ended the series, and the ending of this book is very nihilistic. At the same time, there is a strange sense of optimism as well, because it is kind of implied that Roland may one day get out of the situation that he ends up in at the end of this book, but once again, that's all I really want to say about the ending of this novel. But yeah, I enjoyed the final Dark Tower novel. I get why some people didn't like it. Like, I get why people didn't like these final 3 Dark Tower novels, but I really enjoyed them despite their flaws, and I do think this is a very flawed book, but I still really enjoy it. Once again, my biggest issue with this book is what Stephen King did to Randall Flagg, who, in my opinion, is one of his most compelling villains. Now, this edition of the book I have is actually an illustrated edition, and I just want to show some of the illustrations in this book that I actually think are kind of cool. Like, right there, that's Father Callahan doing battle with the vampires and the low men. That's Randall Flagg, and it's actually a really cool picture of Randall Flagg as well. That's the Crimson King, and I've actually shown this picture before. When I've talked about the Crimson King, I've had this picture show up, and that's Mordred, and this is Roland right here. There are a few other illustrations in the book, but some of them display scenes that might get into major spoiler territory. Now, as I mentioned before, the actual story for the Dark Tower series ends in this book. However, in 2012, Stephen King published an 8th Dark Tower novel titled The Wind Through the Keyhole, which was actually set between the events of books 4 and 5 of this series. Now, that one I actually am rereading, and that's going to be my next book review. There's also now a series of Marvel comic books that are based on the Dark Tower series, most of which are written by Peter David. Now, the series started as sort of like prequels to the Dark Tower series, but now they're actually adapting the events from the books. Now, I don't really count the comic books as being canon, however, they're not bad, and Peter David is a really good writer, but I'm not really sure if I really count them as canon or not. And now you have the new film adaptation of the Dark Tower series, which I'm actually seeing tonight, and to say I'm worried is an understatement. Like, I'm scared shitless. Like, I really don't want this movie to suck. I really don't, and I've been avoiding reviews for this movie like Captain Trips. Like, I want to go into this movie completely open-minded, and I'm nervous, but I'm also optimistic, but also realistic too. Like, I'm well aware that the movie could suck, or I might just find the movie to be okay, but I want to be surprised by this movie though. I really do. But, like, this is easily like one of my most anticipated films of the year. At the same time, it's the movie that I'm really the most worried about. And also, the film is being co-written by Akiva Goldsman, who is not a screenwriter that I particularly like, so that is one thing I'm really worried about. But we're gonna see. I'm gonna be seeing the movie tonight, and I'm going to be reviewing Wind Through the Keyhole before I review the movie, but after I do my review of Wind Through the Keyhole, you will see a review of the film from me, so you'll see what my thoughts of the film are when I do that review. But yeah, that was my review on The Dark Tower VII, The Dark Tower by Stephen King, and bye.